I was halfway through a 12-hour emergency room shift on Christmas Eve when my phone buzzed with a single text from my daughter coming home. They said there's no room. It didn't register at first. I thought she was joking, or maybe there was a mix-up. But when I stepped into our quiet, dimly lit house past midnight, I saw her boots by the door, her overnight bag still zipped, her coat tossed haphazardly over the armrest like it had been dropped in defeat. And there she was, curled up on the couch, wearing her nicest red sweater, the one she picked just for the dinner she was supposed to attend. Her body folded into itself like she didn't trust the furniture to hold her. My name is Lauren Adams, and I've spent most of my life believing in second chances, even when the first ones were never really mine. I'm a trauma nurse. I've seen people brought back from the brink. I've also seen how some wounds never close, not because they're too deep, but because no one ever bothered to clean them out properly. That night, standing in the silence of our home, I felt something unravel. Abby, my 16-year-old daughter, had left that afternoon, excited, proud of being trusted, to drive herself to her grandparents' traditional Christmas Eve gathering. She'd even baked a tin of cookies to share with her younger cousins. We'd smiled as she left, both of us assuming foolishly that kindness would be met with kindness. Instead, she came home alone. I didn't wake her. I sat down quietly across from her and just watched the way her brow stayed tight even in sleep, like she was bracing for something. That's the kind of night it was. But let's rewind, because this story doesn't begin with Abby being turned away. It begins with a slow drip of years where I kept giving and they kept taking. And somewhere in that rhythm, I forgot what boundaries were even supposed to look like. But I remembered that night. Because my daughter had been rejected not with cruelty, not even with words, but with indifference. And somehow that cut deeper. If you've ever stood at the edge of a room filled with people who claimed to love you, but couldn't make space for you, you know the ache I'm talking about. And if you've ever felt that ache, leave a like and stay with me. This isn't just a story about a ruined Christmas. It's about reclaiming something more. It was in that moment, watching my daughter's chest rise and fall, as she tried to sleep off a wound she couldn't name, that I made a decision. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't try to reason with people who had already measured my daughter's worth and found her inconvenient. I would respond, but I would do it in my own way, quietly, strategically, permanently. The shift that night at the hospital had been brutal: chest compressions, grief, adrenaline crashes, but what stayed with me wasn't the trauma of my patients. It was the quiet heartbreak of realizing that I had trusted people who couldn't even spare a chair for my daughter. I didn't cry. Not then. I simply picked up the blanket at the foot of the couch and laid it gently over Abby's shoulders. She stirred, murmured something I couldn't catch, then drifted back into restless sleep. The tin of cookies she'd baked sat unopened on the coffee table. So did the story I was about to tell. Because what they didn't know, what they had no idea was coming, was that I had finally reached the edge of what I was willing to give. And this time I wouldn't be giving forgiveness. I'd be giving them a lesson. Wrapped in a legal envelope. Delivered to their doorstep. Merry Christmas. I woke to the sound of a fork clinking against a plate. At first I thought I was still in the hospital, another shift, another patient. But it was just Abby standing in the kitchen with the early morning light bleeding in through the blinds. Her hair was a little frizzy from sleep, and she still wore that same red sweater. Her eyes were puffy but dry now. She looked older somehow. She'd made herself a slice of toast. Just one. I walked in slowly, unsure if I should say anything. She glanced up, offered a tight smile, then pointed at the counter. "I made extra if you want," she said. On the plate was another slice of toast, slightly burnt, a banana cut in half beside it like a garnish she didn't really want to eat. I didn't touch it. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked, keeping my voice as soft as possible. I didn't want her to feel like she'd done something wrong. She hadn't. Abby shrugged. "Didn't want to bother you. You were at work, saving lives." "And you were alone on Christmas," I replied. She didn't answer. She sat down at the table, the toast untouched now. Her fingers traced the edge of the napkin under her plate. "They said it was a full house," she murmured. Grandma opened the door and looked surprised to see me. She said they weren't expecting me, that they couldn't just add another chair. Aunt Lacey nodded like she agreed. I told them I was fine to sit in the kitchen or even on the floor, but Grandma said it wouldn't be proper. I felt my fingers curl slowly around the back of the chair, and the couch. No room there either. Another shrug. They said all the beds were taken. I offered to sleep on a blanket in the living room, but she said it wasn't safe, that it'd be better if I drove home before it got too late. I swallowed hard. Did anyone try to stop you? Offer to walk you out? She shook her head. Uncle Mike waved goodbye, I think. But no one else said anything. Everyone was too busy talking to Lily. Of course, my niece, the shining star, the golden girl, the one who got the seat at the table and in Abby's usual spot, no less. They said maybe next year. Abby added, her voice even quieter now, but it didn't sound like a promise. She looked down at her plate again. I wasn't even hungry. I just wanted to be included. That's all. I just wanted to be part of it. That was when it hit me. Abby wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't angry. She was doing something worse. She was accepting it, like exclusion was normal, like she believed it was somehow her fault. That's what broke me. Because I knew that feeling too well. I had spent years trying to earn my seat. First, as the awkward, science-obsessed kid who wanted anatomy books for Christmas. Then as the med school student who skipped parties to study. Even after becoming a nurse, I was never enough. Never warm enough. Never likable enough. Always too much or too little of something. And now they had taken that same quiet rejection and handed it down to Abby like it was tradition. Like it was legacy. I pulled out a chair, sat beside her, and placed my hand over hers. You did nothing wrong, I told her. Absolutely nothing. She didn't cry. She didn't have to. The silence between us said everything. There was a half-wrapped gift still in her overnight bag. A small knit scarf she'd made for her grandfather. She'd chosen the colors herself, navy and gray, his favorites. She hadn't even taken it out. Can I stay home next Christmas? She asked suddenly. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said. From now on, you don't go where you're not welcome. She smiled weakly. Good. I stood and walked to the window. The sky was pale now, soft pink bleeding into a muted blue. And in that fragile light, I knew what I had to do. Because if they could turn away a girl who showed up with cookies and kindness, they didn't deserve another inch of space in our lives. And I wouldn't wait for next Christmas to make that clear. Abby went back to bed not long after breakfast, but I couldn't sit still. The house was quiet in that unfamiliar, eerie way it gets after disappointment. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, it's heavy. And I kept seeing her face from the night before, too calm, too understanding. 16-year-olds shouldn't be that good at swallowing pain. I walked past her bag again, still zipped, still hopeful. I couldn't stop thinking about how carefully she must have packed it. The tin of cookies she made herself sat untouched on the kitchen counter, the ribbon still tied in a perfect bow. I imagined her standing at the door last night holding that tin in both hands, waiting to be welcomed, and being told she was too much, too late, too unexpected. I remembered my own moments like that, and there were more than I cared to admit. My entire life I had mastered the art of shrinking myself to fit inside spaces people claimed were full. I was always the intense one, the one who tried too hard, the one who made others uncomfortable, just by existing. Abby had never made me feel that way. And yet here she was inheriting the exile I thought I'd buried long ago. That's when I opened the fridge. There was nothing in there. We hadn't stocked anything special for Christmas because we trusted them. I'd never even considered a backup plan. Why would I? In my mind, they were still the kind of people who'd never turn away a teenager in the cold. And maybe that's the most dangerous lie of all the ones we tell ourselves about people who stopped deserving that faith a long time ago. I closed the fridge and leaned against the counter, staring at the toast crumbs left from earlier. I kept picturing Abby standing at their door, waiting for someone to say, "Come in." Just one gesture of warmth, one seat, one blanket on the couch, one person saying, "You matter." Instead, they'd made room for everyone but her, 28 people. Even the neighbor's cousin's kid. But not Abby. And in that math, the only variable that mattered was her. I thought about my sister Lacey, and how she always managed to be in the background agreeing with whoever had the loudest voice. How she probably stood behind Mom as the door was shut, nodding sympathetically. It's just too full this year. How Grandpa probably smiled at Lily and didn't even notice Abby standing there. I sat down at the table and stared at the tin of cookies. Abby had spent all week testing different batches. She even asked me if chocolate chip felt too basic and if oatmeal was too old school. She just wanted to get it right. She wanted to be seen, and they didn't even open it. That's when I knew. I wasn't going to let this sit. Not like all the other times I'd bitten my tongue and swallowed the ache. I'd stayed quiet when they forgot my birthday, when they called me too ambitious, when they questioned why I worked so hard just to end up alone, when they asked why I didn't smile more. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about Abby. This was about the legacy I refused to pass down. I stood up, pulled open the drawer where we kept all the envelopes and stamps. My hands moved without hesitation. I found the house deed, the original mortgage papers, the receipts. I'd kept everyone. 7 years of silent support, all documented, all signed. I drafted the letter carefully, not out of spite, not out of pettiness, out of clarity, out of love. Because if they could look a 16-year-old girl in the eyes and say there's no room, then I would make sure they understood what that actually felt like. Not metaphorically, legally. I folded the letter, slipped it into the envelope, wrote their names on the front in firm, steady handwriting. And then I just sat there, not angry, not even sad, just certain that I'd been the bridge for too long. And now it was time to let it burn. The next morning was still wrapped in that strange holiday stillness, the kind that clings to the air like sugar dust and leftover tension. Abby was still asleep, her hand curled under her cheek like she was holding on to something only she could see. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just watching her. Then I turned away and quietly closed the door. I knew I wouldn't come back the same. I sat with my husband over a silent cup of coffee. He's not a man of many words. Cal is steady, solid, the kind of person you lean against without realizing it. I told him everything, not just what happened to Abby, but what I planned to do. I expected a dozen questions. What if they retaliate? What if the family turns on you? He didn't ask any of that. He just looked at me and said, "So, we're doing this." I nodded. We are. The letter sat on the kitchen table between us, sealed and addressed. In that moment, it felt heavier than it should have. 7 years ago, I bought my parents that house when their landlord raised the rent for the 3rd time. I paid the down payment in full, took out the mortgage in my name, and told them, "You'll never have to worry again." They never did. Until now. We drove over around 9. I was hoping they'd be out, maybe off visiting someone else they hadn't made room for. But their cars were in the driveway, along with a couple of extras I didn't recognize. Probably Lacey's boyfriend, or one of my cousins, who still thought Mom's apple cider counted as medicine. I stood at the door, the letter clutched in my gloved hand. I rang the bell once, then again. I could hear movement inside, laughter voices, the scraping of a chair. Someone turned down the music. Then, nothing. No one answered. Cal stepped beside me. "Let's just leave it," he said softly, placing his hand lightly on the small of my back. I hesitated for a breath longer than I meant to. Then I nodded. As we turned back toward the car, I slipped the envelope carefully under the edge of the welcome mat, weighted it down with a tiny snowman decoration that hadn't aged well, its carrot nose now chipped and pointing downward like it, too, was ashamed. We were halfway to the car when the door creaked open behind us. My mother's voice. High-pitched, familiar, tinged with that trademark blend of disbelief and disgust. "What is this?" I turned slowly. There she stood, wrapped in her old pink holiday robe, the same one she'd worn every Christmas morning since I was a kid. In her hand, the envelope already torn open. Her eyes scanned the letter. Her lips parted slightly, then curled into something between a sneer and a tremble. "Frank," she yelled behind her. "Frank, get out here. She's throwing us out." My father appeared in the doorway in yesterday's clothes, rubbing sleep from his eyes like the drama had personally offended his nap. Behind him came Lacey, hair still damp, holding a coffee mug that read, "World's Best Aunt." No one said Abby's name. Not once. "You ungrateful little—" My mother hissed, voice shaking now. "After everything we've done for you." My jaw tightened, but I said nothing. What was there to say? They saw me not as a daughter, not even as family, but as a utility. A backup plan. An endless source of support they didn't even have the decency to respect. As we turned to leave, my mother shouted, "If you do this, you're no daughter of mine." I stopped just long enough to look her in the eye and say, "You made that decision long before I did." She stood there frozen still, clutching the letter, her robe flapping slightly in the cold December wind. We drove away quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't grief. It was relief. It didn't take long for the calls to start. My phone began buzzing before we even made it home. At first I ignored it. I needed a few hours of stillness. I wanted to sit with Abby, maybe watch one of those feel-good holiday movies we used to love where people actually get second chances, where kindness is rewarded, not used as a weakness. But life rarely plays out like a Christmas special. By the time I walked through our front door, I had 8 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and a growing list of text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. The first voicemail was from my mother screaming so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. "You've lost your damn mind," she shrieked. "You think you can just throw us out like we're trash? You'll regret this. You'll regret it when you're old and no one's around to care about you." In the background, I heard my father bellow something about how I'd never been grateful, never been normal, and how if I did this, you're no daughter of ours. Not once did they mention Abby. Not once did they ask if she was okay. They didn't even say her name. Janelle, of course, chimed in next. Her message was pure performance, tight voice, fake concern layered under passive-aggressive venom. "Kate, this is going to ruin your reputation. Think of your career. You work in healthcare. People talk." I laughed at that one. "My patience," I murmured aloud. "Don't care who lives in my parents' guest room." But still something inside me cracked a little. Not regret, not second thoughts. Just weariness. The kind that comes from realizing you've built your life around people who never saw the scaffolding you held up to keep them standing. That night, Abby and I sat on the couch watching a rerun of a holiday baking show. She leaned against me, legs curled beneath a blanket, her hair damp from a long, steamy shower. Every once in a while, her eyes drifted toward her phone, but she didn't pick it up. Neither did I. The messages kept coming. One cousin even had the audacity to text, "Not my place. But this feels extreme. You only get one mom." Right. And some of us only get one chance to protect our daughter from a lifetime of being treated like she's optional. I didn't reply. Instead, I reached over and gently tapped Abby's hand. "Want to bake something?" She looked up startled, then grinned. "Even after all the cookies?" I nodded, especially after all the cookies. We pulled out flour, sugar, and butter, made a mess of the kitchen, and laughed for the first time in days. The oven warmed the house, and the scent of cinnamon and brown sugar coated the air like comfort. As she measured, stirred, and taste-tested, I saw her ease back into herself, not the version of Abby who came home last night, but the one who believed in magic and being wanted in holidays that felt like home. And as I stood there watching her scrape dough into neat circles on the baking tray, I realized I hadn't destroyed a family. I'd dismantled a cycle. A cycle of guilt, of performance, of silence. Of always being the good daughter while sacrificing the chance to be a good mother. I chose differently this time. For her. For me, for the future we deserved. If you've ever had to choose between loyalty and protection, if you've ever stood at that painful crossroads, share your story below. Because sometimes drawing the line isn't cruelty, it's clarity. And if this moment speaks to something inside you, take a second to tap, like, let's walk this path together, even if the world says you're walking away. We finished baking just past midnight. Abby snuck 2 cookies before brushing her teeth and heading off to bed. She kissed my cheek as she went. "Next year," she said softly, "can it just be us?" I didn't even hesitate. Next year, I said we make our own table. 3 weeks before Christmas, I had said no. That one word, 2 letters, was the spark. Janelle had called me sounding unusually cheerful the way people do when they're about to ask you for something wrapped in flattery. Her daughter Lily had been accepted into some elite STEM summer camp, the kind that markets itself like a launch pad to NASA, but charges enough to orbit the moon. "She's got your brain," Janelle gushed. "This could change her life." I was halfway through reheating leftover lasagna when I asked how much. $2,200, she said with a chirp in her voice like it was nothing. "But it's worth it. And I mean you of all people." That's where I stopped listening. I thought of Abby, how she'd never once asked for something that extravagant. How she always looked for the clearance tag before picking a hoodie. How she used her own babysitting money to buy a used Kindle just so she could read more without bothering me. I told Janelle no. Politely, clearly, firmly. I explained I was already covering our parents' mortgage, medical bills, and every other family emergency that miraculously landed on my doorstep. I suggested financial aid, payment plans, a dozen ways she could try that didn't include my checkbook. The shift in her tone was instantaneous. "Wow," she said, cold and sharp. "Must be nice to have everything and still be that stingy. She's your niece Kate. She's actually going places, unlike some people." That last part stung in the way a wasp's sting does, not because it was unexpected, but because it was familiar. A week later, I overheard my mother in the background during a speakerphone call with Dad. She thought I had already hung up. She muttered something about how I was holding Lily back, just like I always held Janelle back, by being too smart, too independent, too me. That phone call ended with me staring at the wall for a long time. I hadn't planned revenge. I hadn't plotted some grand takedown. But I did something else. I remembered. I remembered every quiet moment where they called me selfish after I stayed up all night charting patient records. Every dinner I skipped so I could work overtime and still be told, well, must be nice to have your own car. Every time they belittled my success with the backhanded compliment of she thinks she's better than us. And still I kept showing up, kept saying yes, kept hoping that someday, if I gave enough, loved enough, supported enough, they'd stop keeping score and start seeing me. But they never did. And when Abby came home that night, rejected like an afterthought, it wasn't just about a full table. It was about years of pretending I belonged in a family that had only ever wanted parts of me. The parts that paid, the parts that smiled, the parts that stayed quiet. But I'm not quiet anymore. They'd made it clear the only seat I was allowed to have was the one I built for everyone else. And now I was done building. Because I finally understood there's a difference between generosity and surrender. And for too long, I confused the two. I went to work the next day like normal, scrubbed in, held hands, checked pulses. I saved lives while the people I had tried for years to save from themselves were too busy whispering about how much I'd changed. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd stopped being the family's safety net and started being my daughter's protector. A week before Christmas, Abby wrapped little gifts for every cousin, even Lily. She folded her clothes neatly in her overnight bag, baked the cookies herself. She was proud, nervous, but proud. She said she felt grown up being trusted to drive. She had no idea the doors would be shut before she even knocked. If you've ever realized too late that you've been giving love to people who only ever loved what you gave, comment below. Because recognizing it is the first step in reclaiming your worth. Christmas Eve arrived like it always did in our family, loud, chaotic, and drenched in expectations. Abby had spent the day carefully curling her hair, ironing her sweater, and double-checking that the wrapping paper on her gifts hadn't come loose. She even asked me twice if she should bring a second pair of shoes in case it snowed. "Are you sure it's okay if I drive myself?" she asked, keys in hand, eyes wide with that quiet kind of excitement that only 16-year-olds can still manage. I smiled, though something tugged at me. "You've earned it. Text me when you get there." She nodded, kissed my cheek, and disappeared out the front door with her bag, her cookies, and a heart full of belief that this year would be different. That they'd see her. That she belonged. I didn't hear from her for 4 hours. By the time I got off my shift and pulled into the driveway, her car was already parked out front. The porch light was off, the curtains drawn. I knew something was wrong before I even stepped through the door. She was curled up on the couch, fully dressed, arms wrapped around her knees like armor. I crouched beside her, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Abby." She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream she hadn't wanted to be part of. "Hey," she whispered. I didn't ask right away. I just sat there until the silence softened. Then came the words, halting, quiet but sharp as broken glass. "I got there right on time," she began, voice steady but low. "Grandma opened the door like she wasn't expecting me, like I'd shown up to the wrong house." I said nothing. She told me there was no room at the table, that all the seats were already filled. I offered to sit in the living room, even on the stairs if I had to, but she said it wouldn't be fair to the others, that I should have let them know ahead of time. "But we did," I whispered. She nodded. "I know, but I didn't want to argue." Then she said they didn't have a bed for me, that I could stay if I didn't mind sleeping on the floor, but it was probably better if I just went home. Safer, less complicated. My chest tightened. "Did anyone say anything?" I asked. She shrugged. Uncle Paul waved. Lily was sitting in my usual spot. Grandpa was pouring her cider like she was a guest of honor. Aunt Lacey said maybe next year. No one else even looked at me. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from saying something I'd regret. "They said it wasn't personal," Abby added, "but it felt like it was. I wasn't angry, I was just invisible." She looked toward the coffee table where the tin of cookies still sat unopened. "I didn't want to come home and ruin your night," she whispered, "so I made toast. A slice of cold bread, half a banana. That was her Christmas dinner." She blinked hard, holding it in. "I brought Grandpa a scarf I knitted," she said suddenly. "I picked his favorite colors. I didn't even take it out of the bag. I didn't want to make things awkward." I wrapped my arms around her. She leaned into me like she was finally letting go of something she didn't have the strength to carry anymore. "They don't like you," she said almost like a confession. But I thought I was just the kid, not part of all that. I swallowed the lump in my throat. She paused, then added with a bitter little laugh, "They didn't even say it to be mean. It was like I was a folding chair they forgot to bring out." That was the moment something snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. They hadn't forgotten her. They had chosen to exclude her, chosen to make a point, and used my daughter to deliver it. The sun had barely risen on Christmas morning when I placed the envelope beneath their doormat. I didn't linger, no hesitation, no deep breath, no second guess. Just the quiet certainty that something irreversible had happened the night before. Something I couldn't file away under just family being family. Not this time. Abby was still asleep when I returned home, the red sweater she'd picked out bunched at the sleeve, a tiny thread loose along the cuff. Her overnight bag was untouched. The tin of cookies had moved from the table to the counter, but remained sealed like a symbol of every effort she'd made to be seen, and how utterly that effort had been dismissed. Cal was already at the kitchen table when I came back inside. He didn't ask if I did it. He just passed me a cup of coffee and said, "So, what now?" I sat down slowly, letting the heat from the mug seep into my hands. I didn't answer right away. The words weren't ready. Or maybe I didn't want to say them out loud yet because saying them would make everything permanent. But I knew what I'd written in that letter. I'd outlined the timeline when I bought the house for them 7 years ago when I took over the mortgage, when I covered their utilities month after month without fail. I detailed the payments, attached copies of receipts, even printed the deed with my name bolded across the top. I made it undeniable. And I gave them 60 days. Not out of cruelty, out of fairness. They'd made it clear that they were more than willing to treat Abby like she didn't belong. They'd chosen convenience over compassion, image over inclusion. But they didn't get to keep the roof over their heads while cutting out my daughter from the very family she was born into. It wasn't just about Christmas anymore. It was about a lifetime of decisions I had let slide. Subtle digs, dismissive comments. The way they always had something nicer to say about Janelle even when she was doing the bare minimum, and something critical to say about me even when I gave everything I had. I had absorbed it all, chalked it up to generational trauma, to miscommunication, to the complexity of family. But Abby, she had done nothing but show up, cookies in hand, smile on her face, hope in her heart. And they looked her in the eyes and said, "No room. Not we're full. Not we're sorry. Just not you." And if I didn't respond, if I didn't show her what protection really looks like, then I was complicit. I sipped my coffee, staring at the window as light stretched across the frost-covered lawn. The world looked peaceful, but inside me everything was shifting. I wasn't just removing them from the house. I was removing myself from the role they had forced me to play for so long, the fixer, the giver, the silent daughter who kept the family machine running while being called a misfit behind her back. That morning, as I sat in the quiet of our kitchen, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolute. There would be fallout. I knew that. There would be yelling, tears, accusations. But for once, I wouldn't flinch. Because I'd made peace with the fact that not everyone deserves a second chance just because they share your DNA. Some people only come around when they need something. Others disappear when you need them most. And some throw your daughter out on Christmas Eve and expect to be hugged in return. Not anymore. Not ever again. The thing about family drama is that it doesn't explode all at once, it unravels. And the unraveling began with one small sound. A ding. My phone left on the hallway table buzzed with a new voicemail before I'd even returned from delivering the letter. I didn't listen to it. I knew who it was. Knew the exact tone my mother's voice would carry, indignation disguised as heartbreak. By noon, I had 6 more messages, most of them from Janelle. She didn't call. She texted long, winding paragraphs that tried to masquerade as concern but reeked of control. "We should talk. This is all a huge misunderstanding." They didn't mean to hurt Abby. You know how stressed they get hosting. Think about what this is doing to the rest of us. The rest of us. That line stayed with me. Not what this did to Abby, not how could we make it right, but how my refusal to let this go was inconvenient for them. I turned my phone on silent and slipped it into a drawer. Later that evening, I opened it again, just long enough to find 14 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and a new text from an unknown number. "Hope you're proud of what you've done." I didn't reply. I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there like a fossil of everything I was done tolerating. When Abby came downstairs, she was wearing pajama pants and the faded college hoodie I'd had since nursing school. She looked lighter somehow, like some of the weight she'd been carrying had started to lift. "Can we decorate cookies?" she asked. I blinked. "You still want to?" She smiled. "Yeah, just us this time." We pulled out what was left of the dough from the night before and used cookie cutters shaped like snowflake stars, even a lopsided gingerbread man. The kitchen filled with laughter. It felt easy, natural, like something that belonged to us, not borrowed from a version of family we no longer owed loyalty to. And while Abby decorated a cookie with blue icing and way too many sprinkles, I thought about all the times I had tried to explain my family away. They mean well. They don't know better. They come from a different time. But none of those things excused what they did. None of those things changed the way Abby had been made to feel small, disposable, unwelcome. They could argue intentions all day. But Impact is a 16-year-old girl eating toast on Christmas Eve with red eyes and a shaking voice trying not to ruin her mother's night. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a message. A loud, clear message that said, "You're not part of this." Well, message received. Loud and clear. The next morning I called my lawyer. I told him everything: the mortgage in my name, the utility bills I'd covered, the quiet agreements that were never written but always expected. He asked only one question. "Do you want to file a formal eviction?" I paused, then said, "Yes, I do." It wasn't spite. It was closure. They had already shut the door on Abby. I was simply making sure it stayed that way. I met with my lawyer 2 days after Christmas. His office was quiet, carpeted in that sterile beige that makes everything feel less personal, which honestly was a blessing. I didn't need emotion clouding this decision. Not now. He skimmed through the paperwork with the efficiency of someone who'd seen it all before. Mortgage agreements, utility bills, a folder of printed receipts I had neatly labeled by year. 7 years of quiet financial support laid out in black and white. Evidence of everything I'd done and everything they'd chosen to ignore. He looked up. "You want this processed as a standard 60-day notice?" I nodded. "Vacant possession required." "Yes," I said, "and I want it on paper this time. Signed, certified, no more misunderstandings." He didn't flinch, understood. It felt strange how easy it was, how calm. For something that had lived in my bones for so long, the guilt, the obligation, the desperate hope for their approval, it ended not with yelling, not with tears, but with a form, a signature, and a file folder. I walked out of that office feeling weightless. When I got home, the house was quiet. Abby was on the porch sipping tea wrapped in a fuzzy blanket, her headphones in one foot, tapping softly to some rhythm only she could hear. I didn't interrupt her. I stood in the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stared at the near-empty shelves again. Not out of hunger, but memory. Because once upon a time I thought family was something you kept feeding no matter how hungry you got. That love meant always saying yes. That loyalty was bending until you broke. But now I knew better. You can't feed a fire that keeps burning you and expect warmth in return. That night the phone rang again. My mother. I didn't answer. Then came a knock at the door. I checked the peephole. Of course. She stood on the porch in the same pink robe, hair undone, holding the eviction notice in her hand like it was some personal betrayal, not a legal boundary. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "You're really doing this?" she snapped. "After everything we've done for you?" I didn't yell, didn't defend. I just looked her in the eye and said, "You mean the house I bought for you, the bills I paid, the health coverage I arranged because your Medicare didn't cover your blood pressure meds?" She flinched just a little but recovered quickly. "We raised you," she spat. "We gave you everything." "No," I replied calmly. "You gave me life. I gave you everything else." Her voice cracked as she tried to find footing. "It was just a misunderstanding. You're blowing it out of proportion." "You didn't let my daughter eat dinner," I said. "You had 28 people at that table and no room for your own granddaughter." She crossed her arms, huffing. "We didn't have enough chairs. I wasn't aware compassion required furniture." She rolled her eyes. "God, you're so dramatic." I let out a slow breath. "This isn't drama. This is consequence." And then, like a bad soap opera, she ripped the eviction notice in half. Just stood there tearing it down the middle like that would magically erase the truth. Then she smiled like she'd just won. "You pay for Lily's science camp," she said, "and we'll forgive you." I laughed. Not out loud. Not cruelly. Just in my mind, the kind of laugh that comes when you finally see someone for who they are. Not the version you hoped they'd be. Not the mother you pretended she could become. But the woman who had used your kindness as currency for so long that she forgot you could stop giving. If you've ever been told forgiveness is something you have to earn from the people who hurt you, I hope you hear this clearly. You don't owe anyone the right to break you twice. And if you're choosing boundaries over burnout, hit like, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to hear it too. You are not selfish for choosing peace. You are wise. You are brave. You are enough. She walked off the porch, muttering, the torn letter still clutched in one hand, like shredded proof of her entitlement. I didn't follow her. I didn't shout after her. I simply closed the door behind her and turned the lock, not to keep her out, but to keep peace in. 2 days later, the silence broke again. Not through my mother this time, but Janelle. She showed up, unannounced, eyes puffy, her hair tied back in a messy bun that suggested she hadn't slept much. She didn't even bother with a greeting. I can't do it, she said, standing on my porch like a woman on the brink. They're driving me insane. I leaned against the doorframe. I assume they've moved in with you. She exhaled hard. They won't stop bickering. Mom says the living room's too small. Dad complains my kids are too loud. They won't share a bathroom. They won't agree on food. My husband's ready to sleep in the car. I waited. They said you'd help, she added, her voice shifting. That you'd at least help with the deposit on a rental. Just something small. I studied her. You stood there, I said softly. You watched Abby walk out of that house. You saw the way she looked. And you did nothing. She blinked, lips parting like she was ready to defend herself, but no words came. That was your choice, I continued. This is mine. She stood in stunned silence for a moment, like she hadn't expected me to draw the line so clearly. And then she turned and walked back to her car without another word. A week later, they were gone. Kicked out, according to a cousin who'd heard it from someone else. They ended up in a small rental across town, 2 rooms, 1 heater, and a front step so crooked it leaned like a shrug. The kind of place no one brags about, but just barely manages to survive in. From what I heard, their pensions covered rent and groceries just barely. The vacations stopped, the birthday dinners faded, the anniversary cruise they'd been planning forgotten. They tried to call, of course. Left messages about how I'd abandoned them, painted me as cold and unstable to anyone who'd listen. They told extended family that I'd thrown them out over a silly misunderstanding, that I'd lost my mind. But I wasn't silent. Not this time. I gathered the receipts, the house payments, utility bills, medical coverage records. I scanned the formal eviction letter, time-stamped, signed, certified. I sent it all quietly, respectfully, to the people who mattered. The ones they had turned to for sympathy. The cousins, the uncles, the family friends who had been fed one version of the story. And the response? Silence. One cousin replied with a simple wow. Another sent a thumbs-up emoji. No one came rushing to rescue them. No one offered to help them relocate. And I didn't either. Because when the smoke cleared, the truth stood on its own, unapologetic, undeniable. They hadn't just hurt me. They hurt Abby. And for that, there was no more room. No more money. No more saving them from the consequences they had spent a lifetime avoiding. That week, for the first time in years, our home felt still. Not empty. Still. Like a lake finally free of ripples. Abby smiled more. I slept better. The quiet didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt earned. We baked again, watched movies, started planning a spring trip, just the 2 of us. No expectations, no guilt, no need to ask for permission to be included. Just us. It didn't take long before the storytelling started. Not mine, theirs. They painted themselves as victims cast aside by their own daughter, stripped of their home, and left to fend for themselves in what they described as a rundown shoebox with broken heating. Their version spread fast like gossip always does. And the worst part, they didn't whisper. They broadcasted it. Family group chats, church prayer requests, even a teary voicemail from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. She's punishing us, my mother had said in one of the messages. All over a misunderstanding, we just ran out of chairs. That girl Abby, she took it too personally. She's too sensitive. That girl, not her granddaughter. Not the teenager who had baked cookies and picked out a scarf and asked for nothing but a place to sit. I listened to that voicemail once, just once, and then I deleted it. But I didn't stop there. I went into the drawer where I'd kept every receipt, every signed document, every record of what I'd paid for since the day I handed my parents the keys to their house. I opened my laptop, scanned them one by one, and labeled the files by year. Then I drafted an email, not angry, not bitter, just factual. I sent it to the 12 or so family members who had reached out with concern. I didn't tell them how to feel. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, I want you to have the full context. Read. Decide for yourselves. The fallout was quiet. Too quiet. One cousin replied with a single word, understood. Another simply wrote, Thank you for telling the truth. No one asked for more details. No one asked for clarification. They'd heard the other side already, and now finally they had mine. And just like that, the flood of calls stopped. No more texts from Janelle. No more voicemails from my mom. Just silence. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like permission. Permission to move on. To stop explaining. To stop absorbing the blame for other people's choices. To stop being the glue in a family that had never once tried to stick together for me. That weekend, Abby and I drove upstate to a little cabin I used to rent when I needed to decompress during my residency. It wasn't fancy, 2 rooms, a tiny fireplace, and a coffee pot that rattled, but it was ours for 2 days. We brought books, board games, a suitcase of snacks, and we made no plans. No agenda. Just space. On the second night, as we roasted marshmallows and watched the snow fall outside the window, Abby said something I'll never forget. "You know what's weird?" she said. "I don't miss them." I looked at her, trying to gauge whether it was bravado, teen defiance, or something deeper. But her face was calm. Not angry, not bitter. Just honest. "Neither do I said. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. The fire crackled, the marshmallows toasted to that perfect golden brown, and the world for once didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt still, like we had finally exhaled. They didn't stop, of course. Even when the family went quiet, even after the truth was quietly acknowledged, there was always one last ember of control burning in their corner. They tried new tactics, quieter ones, more insidious. A postcard arrived. No return address. Just a photo of a beach from a place they could never afford now. On the back, a single sentence scrawled in my mother's tight cursive, "We hope you're happy. Not we're sorry. Not how's Abby." Just guilt, packaged and mailed. I didn't respond. I didn't bring it up to Abby either. I'd made a promise, not just to her, but to myself, that we weren't going back. Not in conversation, not in action, not even in memory if we could help it. But life has a way of reminding you who people really are, especially when they think you've finally moved on. Aunt Marlene texted the next week. One of those vague, guilt-laced messages, boomers think passes for reconciliation family, isn't perfect, but it's all we've got. She followed it with a YouTube link to a sermon about forgiveness. I didn't open it. Instead, I sent her a single PDF, a copy of the eviction notice, legally stamped, time-stamped, and signed. I followed it with one sentence. "Family doesn't make you small to feel big." No reply. 3 days later, my sister posted a Facebook status. Public, of course. Tagged half the family. It's not always the black sheep you have to watch out for. Sometimes it's the one who thinks she's better than everyone else. Cue the comments, the vague subtweets, the crocodile tears. But I didn't take the bait, because I had something they didn't. Proof. Not just of the payments, the deeds, the sacrifices, but of the moment everything changed. A quiet Christmas night. My daughter on the couch, her plate empty. Her eyes full of questions no 16-year-old should ever have to ask. And I had my answer. Not in a quote, not in a meme. In action. They said there was no room for Abby. So I made no room for them. I stopped funding their comfort, stopped cushioning their consequences. I didn't rage. I didn't explain. I simply stopped. And in doing so, I created space, not just in my house, but in my heart. Room for Abby. Room for peace. Room for the version of myself that wasn't defined by bending to stay lovable. Because once I chose Abby, everything else came into focus. Her laughter got louder. Her shoulders relaxed. Her bedroom wasn't just where she slept, it became her sanctuary. She painted her walls a deep forest green and started taping quotes to her mirror. Some were silly, some were sharp, but one in particular stopped me the first time I read it. "You don't have to keep setting yourself on fire to keep others warm." She never asked where it came from. I never asked if she picked it for me. We just left it there taped to the mirror, a daily reminder of what we'd both survived. And when I got a call from an old neighbor a few weeks later, telling me my parents were asking around trying to find a new place to live, I didn't answer. I didn't swoop in, didn't offer help. Because this wasn't just about money or space. It was about value. And they had shown me clearly that Abby's place at their table was optional. So now, so is my place in their lives. If you've ever had to choose between peace and keeping the illusion of family unity, tell me how you chose. Drop it in the comments. Because it takes strength to walk away, not out of hate, but out of love. Love for yourself. Love for the next generation. Love for finally being free. It had been 2 months since that Christmas. 2 months since the letter, since the door closed. Since Abby sat on the couch in that red sweater, eyes full of shame that didn't belong to her. Now she was different. So was I. There was something about shedding the weight of people who only loved the version of you that served them. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like breathing, like someone opened a window you forgot had been painted shut. Abby thrived in that air. She started drawing again, something she hadn't done in over a year. Her notebooks filled with portraits, scenes, quotes she pulled from books and scribbled in the margins. She stopped apologizing when she spoke. She stopped asking if she was too much. She started occupying space without shame. I watched her become her own person. Not the person they tried to mold. Not the girl they looked past in a crowded room. But the young woman who knew exactly what it meant to be left out and decided that wouldn't define her. One afternoon, we sat on the porch sipping iced tea from mismatched mugs, legs propped up on the railing, like two rebels watching the world turn. "I don't miss them," she said, casually, like it was just another thought slipping through the breeze. I turned my head. "You sure?" She nodded. I thought I would. But when I think about it all, I remember as how I always had to be perfect around them. Careful, smaller. She looked over at me. "With you, I don't feel that way." I didn't say anything. I just reached over and squeezed her hand. Because it hit me then, not what I had lost, but what I'd protected. That was the real inheritance I was leaving her, not a trust fund, not a family name built on obligation and image, but the understanding that you don't have to beg to be loved. You don't have to twist yourself into something else to be invited in. That belonging isn't earned by shrinking. It's built by showing up exactly as you are and knowing the right people will make space. My phone buzzed on the table beside us. Unknown number. I picked it up out of habit, not thinking, and saw the message flash across the screen. "Hope you're proud of what you've done." There was no name. There didn't need to be. I looked at Abby. She raised an eyebrow. "Them? Probably." She sipped her tea. "You gonna answer?" I didn't even hesitate. I deleted it. Not in anger. Not to make a point. Just because it didn't deserve my time. "They'll probably text again," Abby said, almost with amusement. "They always do," I replied, "but they're not my problem anymore." And that was true. They weren't. They were people I had once called family. People I had once bent over backward to please. People I had forgiven too many times for too little effort. But now, they were just names in a phone I didn't answer. Ghosts in a story I no longer lived in. Abby leaned her head against my shoulder. "I'm glad we made our own Christmas," she said. I nodded. "Me too, 2 years have passed. Sometimes I still drive by the neighborhood where their old house stood, the one I bought, the one they lived in, like it was theirs. The one I reclaimed when they crossed a line I couldn't uncross. It's owned by a young family now. 2 toddlers run in the yard, plastic toys scattered across the grass. There's a dog always barking. The porch has a new coat of blue paint. The snowman statue I left the eviction letter under long gone. It doesn't look like my past anymore. And that's a gift in itself. My parents still live in the rental. Same 2 rooms. Same broken heater from what I hear. They're still pointing fingers at me at Abby at life. Still telling people I abandoned them over a chair. That's the story they settled on. That's the hill they chose to die on, a folding chair that never existed. But what they never understood is that this was never about a chair. It was about choice. Their choice to make my daughter feel unwelcome. Their choice to treat inclusion like it was conditional. Their choice to weaponize silence and pretend it was peace. Abby is in college now. She's majoring in psychology, minoring in art. She's on a scholarship not because she needed it, but because she earned it. She tutors other students in her free time, volunteers at a shelter on weekends, sends me pictures of the murals she paints in her dorm lobby. Sometimes I catch myself staring at those photos longer than I mean to, overwhelmed by a quiet, relentless pride that catches me off guard. She is everything they refused to see, and I am the mother who finally did. Last week she came home for break. We sat on the porch again, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea the same way we did 2 winters ago. She scrolled through her phone, then turned the screen toward me. A message. "They're still talking about us," she said. Grandma posted something weird about forgiveness again. I smiled, but there was no bitterness in it anymore. "They'll probably keep doing that," I said. "It's easier to talk about what they lost than admit why they lost it." She looked at me and asked, "Do you ever regret it?" And I thought about that night, Christmas Eve, the red sweater, the unopened tin of cookies, the way she had curled herself into the corner of our couch, trying not to take up space. "No," I said softly. "I only regret not doing it sooner." She leaned her head on my shoulder and we didn't speak after that. We didn't have to. The truth was already lived. This story doesn't end with reconciliation. It doesn't wrap up with a group hug or a magical moment where everyone suddenly understands and apologizes. Sometimes stories end with distance and healing and choosing peace over legacy. Sometimes you close the door and it stays closed. Not because you're unforgiving, but because you've finally forgiven yourself enough to walk away from what hurt you. They once said there wasn't room at the table for Abby, so we built our own table, and there will always be room. If you've ever been told there's no room for you, whether in your family, your job, your relationships, remember this: you are allowed to build your own space. You are allowed to draw your own line. You are allowed to protect your peace. And if you believe in that, if you believe in choosing freedom over fear, truth over silence, your worth over their comfort, then subscribe to this channel. Let's write the next chapter together. Let's create a space where no one has to shrink to belong. Leave a comment, share your story, and if this meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We heal by telling the truth and standing in it. The story I just shared with you isn't extraordinary. It's not the kind of headline you'd see on a news ticker or something they'd make a movie out of. There were no fists slammed on tables, no dramatic confrontations in the rain, no screaming matches that split a room in two. It was quiet. It was slow. It was years of small moments, dismissed birthdays, overlooked kindnesses, forced smiles at dinners, where I was always just a little too much or never quite enough. It was carrying the weight of a family that never once reached out to lift mine. And it was believing for far too long that if I just kept giving, maybe they'd finally see me. But the real story, it's about what happens when someone finally does see you and it's your child. When Abby looked at me that night and said, "I thought I was just the kid, not part of it," something in me split open. Because I had once been that kid too, and I'd sworn I would never let her feel what I once did. So I didn't. I chose her. I chose us. And every day since I've chosen peace over performance, love over guilt, boundaries over burnout. And that has made all the difference. So if you're sitting with the weight of being left out, of being the different one, of wondering if your voice, your presence, your truth actually matters, let this be your reminder it does. You matter, and you don't need permission to take up space. There's a table waiting for you, and if there isn't, build it. I'll be right there beside you, and we'll make room for every part of you. Always.